Okay, so we are finally here at the end of our conversation about America Comes of Age, topic 4. You are hopefully by now familiar with these key terms and with this list of be able to do's here. We've been talking about American expansion, and this is a nice little graphic about the economic benefits of American expansion. There's a question down there at the bottom. How did American investment in Cuba in the early 1900s affect the level of sugar production in Cuba? So it's good for the American economy to expand. The other sort of pros and cons are debatable for sure. As the U.S. emerged as a world power following the Spanish American War, American leaders looked to strengthen economic and military interests in Latin America and East Asia. In East Asia, American leaders devised policies to open China and other Asian markets to U.S. producers. Meanwhile, Americans called for a more substantial role in Latin America, viewing the region as the nation's backyard. Increasing influence in both regions brought economic benefits, but also increased international tensions. We're going to be looking at Asia here a lot today. What can you conclude about the influence of the US and China during the early 20th century by looking at that map? Okay, so American diplomacy in Asia. The U.S. Navy has a commanding presence in the Pacific. You remember Alfred Thayer Mahan and his idea of naval supremacy. And we are very interested in Asia as a commerce or a trade outlet, a place where we can get raw materials, but also a marketplace for finished goods. There are concerns over Japan's growing power, and there's also a desire to establish trade footholds in the Pacific. And Russia and other European powers will sort of race to establish a presence in China. The United States is frustrated by this because it's a little bit late to the party, and it's worried that it will be left out. So McKinley and Hay will make clear that they support an open door policy. So they're telling the Europeans, hey, y'all can't, cut off trade from China to anyone it wants to trade with. Make sure that China has an open door. This is a really great political cartoon where you see Uncle Sam holding the key to the open door policy in China. So it will sort of be allowing certain groups in or not as it sees fit. The Boxer Rebellion is another reason for increased, it's a reason for increased American presence in China, and it's also a result of increased American and European presence in China. It has to do with the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. They rebel against the Chinese government, but they do it over frustrations of what they see as growing foreign influence in China. Foreigners are attacked. European powers in the United States respond militarily to help the Chinese government stop the rebellion. And the U.S. used the opportunity to gain even more influence in China.
Hi, my name's Uhuru Williams. I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion began in China in 1900 and was led by a group known as the Order of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, who became known in the West as the Boxers because of their adherence to martial arts and physical exercise. The Boxers were both anti-Christian and anti-foreign, and targeted both Chinese Christians and foreign emissaries whom they believed were attempting to colonize and to take over China. Part of the appeal of the Boxer Rebellion came from a series of humiliations that the Qing dynasty had suffered dating back to the 1830s and 1840s. In a series of unfortunate wars with Western powers and with Japan, China was forced to cede territory and monies to foreign invaders. This rankled the local population, particularly peasants like those from the Shandong province, who blamed some of the flooding, famine, and other natural disasters which befell China in this period on this Western influence. The Boxer Rebellion ended in China in 1900 after a multinational force invaded the capital and were able to liberate those being held hostage by the Boxers. As a result of the violence, China was forced to pay a $330 million reparations bill to the Western powers. In addition, China was forbidden from importing firearms into the nation for 2 years. The Boxer Rebellion would prove to be the death knell for the Qing dynasty, the last great dynasty in China. Young people in large numbers.
Okay. In Latin America, the U.S. is also going to sort of change things up Diplomatically, the U.S. has a goal to be the dominant power in Latin America, and in fact, it already purchases most of its raw materials from Latin America. However, Latin American countries still purchase manufactured goods primarily from Europe, and it makes sense because that is where their historical ties lie. In 1889, you have a Pan-American Conference that was advocated by the Secretary of State at the time, James Blaine. Its goal was to decrease tariffs and create a system for sort of arbitrating disputes between American countries. Latin Americans don't buy into this Pan-American Conference, but they do agree to establish a commercial bureau, again, aimed at sort of improving economic ties with Latin America. Unlike the United States, Japan wanted to expand its influence in China. Like the United States, excuse me, I knew that sounded wrong. Japan also disapproves of the European carve-up of the region. This is where we get the open door demand, right? Furthermore, the Japanese took offense to the presence of Russian troops in Manchuria, a region of China that bordered Russia. In February of 1904, without a declaration of war, Japan attacks and bottles up Russia's Pacific Fleet stationed in China. The Japanese follow up this victory with a series of major land engagements in Manchuria that caused more than 100,000 Russian casualties. This is the Russo-Japanese War. Japan also suffers heavy fighting. As the United States tentatively asserted its interest in East Asia, Americans also called for a more aggressive role in Latin America. American entrepreneurs and government leaders wanted the region to be a sphere of influence from which other great powers were excluded. American influence in Latin America brought obvious benefits to the United States, but also contributed to anti-American hostility and instability in the region. So make sure that you are able to describe U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America in the early 1900s. There is a great political cartoon here. Give her a generous slice. You have Cuba, and says Uncle Sam serves a slice of reciprocity, a reference to a treaty guaranteeing Cuban access to U.S. economic markets. Upon assuming the presidency after McKinley's assassination, Roosevelt promoted a new kind of diplomacy based on American success in the Spanish-American War. Beyond determining what would happen to Puerto Rico and Cuba, Roosevelt developed a broader policy for U.S. action in Latin America. Historians have called this Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, since it depended on a strong military to achieve America's goals. Big stick stemmed from the president's admiration for an old African saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." So this is a cartoon from 1904. There's Roosevelt carrying the big stick, a reference to big stick diplomacy, and he is marching and pulling this sort of American train of naval power through the Caribbean Sea. McKinley is reelected, but he's assassinated. This is an actual artist rendering of the assassination of President McKinley, and so Roosevelt will finish his term. Roosevelt believed in this idea of a white man's burden that I mentioned in another video about, which was a term coined by Rudyard Kipling, a British author. He believed that he had a duty to help those less civilized. This is that idea that I've mentioned also earlier in this topic, where Roosevelt was a social Darwinist when it came to sort of foreign policy, but an advocate of the square deal when it came to domestic policy. He's not advocating for a square deal here for everyone, just for Americans. He also wanted to balance power in East Asia, supporting the open door policy, working to negotiate peace terms between Russia and Japan. But there will still be lingering tensions between the United States and Japan. In terms of the Panama Canal, this is big stick diplomacy, big stick policy on display. What is the purpose of having a canal through Central America, right? How does it economically benefit the United States? We don't start the Panama Canal. Roosevelt will take over construction of the existing canal after the French abandon it due to a whole lot of death because of malaria. In 1903, the U.S. offers to purchase the land outright, but Colombia, who owned the land, refuses, and so the United States supports a rebellion against Colombia, the Panamanian Rebellion against Colombia, and negates access to the land. So essentially, the end result of this involvement is that the United States is given unfettered access and unfettered control in Panama to what's called the Canal Zone. So in that area, the U.S. controls and can do what it wants and will end up building this canal. The Roosevelt corollary, or which is sort of just like an attachment to the Monroe Doctrine, says that the United States will intervene in Latin America whenever it thinks that its political and economic stability in the hemisphere is threatened. Taft, who will succeed Roosevelt in the presidency, believed in dollar diplomacy. So instead of military intervention, he believed in economic intervention. Here are some examples of dollar diplomacy in the early 1900s. Look from 1880, exports to Latin America versus 1913, exports to Latin America. Examples of U.S. businesses abroad. I want us to be able to compare big stick diplomacy as well as dollar diplomacy. So now we're going to bring Wilson back in. During the 1912 presidential election campaign, Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson criticized the foreign policies of Roosevelt and Taft. After his election victory, Wilson appointed an anti-imperialist, William Jennings Bryan, as his Secretary of State, and then which sent a strong message to the American people. So Roosevelt believes in big stick diplomacy. Taft believes in dollar diplomacy. Wilson believes in moral diplomacy, which stated that the U.S. should spread peace and democracy as opposed to colonization, believed other nations should be self-governing, continued to use American military in Latin America, and wished to cultivate a friendship with Latin America. And those last 2 points may be a little contradictory. Wilson was a man of very lofty ideas, but it is important to keep in mind that his lofty ideas were limited to governments and people that he thought were capable of self-governance, and that will come into play in World War I. In Mexico, Wilson opposes imperialism, and instead he wants to focus on domestic concerns. But we do have this Mexican Revolution, which is a very violent revolution in Mexico. A series of Mexican leaders, Mexican presidents, Diaz, Madero, and Huerta. Wilson believes that the only way to do business with Mexico is to recognize government based on rule of law. And so as the government sort of change in Mexico during Wilson's presidency, he will intercept arms and shipments, and he will arm opponents of those that he supports in Mexico. In April of 1914, Wilson will send troops to Mexico. U.S. soldiers will be arrested. But it angers Wilson, and Wilson will use this as an excuse to overthrow the government. The rebels against this U.S. intervention will be the government in charge in Mexico is yet another U.S.-backed government, Carranza, which uses U.S. weapons. The rebels are led by Pancho Villa, who's pictured here in this political cartoon, who Uncle Sam is sort of chasing out. The U.S. troops will be led by General Pershing, which might be familiar to you. He will be the one who ends up leading U.S. forces in Europe, and that will be what ends this American conflict in Mexico, because World War I begins and the United States is needed elsewhere. And think about how the events in Mexico are an example of the failure of Wilson's policies. All right, guys, this was a long one. Thank you for bearing with me, and as always, email me if you have questions.